it's an enormous pleasure to be able to speak with you this evening. And I'm particularly delighted also to see some friends here in the audience, and I want to acknowledge at least my agent, Jim Levine, who had a huge hand in helping to shape this book, as well as I know there are a number of readers here who gave early insightful feedback, so I'm very grateful to New York. Tonight, I want to talk to you about what I believe is perhaps the most important competence that we need in today's challenging times. And that's the competence of getting to yes, both with ourselves and with other worthy opponents. The question is, how can we reach good agreements? How can we build healthy relationships at home, at work, and in the world? And it is often not easy at all. If you look around the world today, if you watch the news, conflict seems to be a growth industry. Everywhere you look, people seem to be very busy, not getting to yes always, but rather often getting to no. And you look at DC as one example where the State of the Union address is going on right now and where there's this stalemate between Democrats and Republicans. Think about your life for a moment. I invite you to think about any kind of conflicts or tensions or difficult conversations you might have had, and I invite you to ask yourself, what makes these conflicts so hard often to resolve? What stops us from getting to yes? And that's the question I'd like to address. My passion for the past 35 years has been helping individuals, organizations, societies get to yes, from family feuds to boardroom battles to labor strikes to civil wars around the world. I seem to have fallen into a specialty of dealing with difficult situations. So I would like to do, if I may, ask you a few questions about your own negotiating experience. If you think about it for a moment, and I were to define negotiation very broadly as simply back and forth communication, you're trying to reach agreement with someone, who do you find yourself negotiating in that broad sense of the term with in the course of your day? If I wouldn't just invite you to call out, just to see what the range here of situations here is. A 3-year-old. A 3-year-old, okay. Those are the tough negotiations. Who else do you negotiate with?
My fiance.
Your fiance. Co-workers, your board. Agents. What was that? Media.
Ego.
Your own ego, exactly, or other people's ego. Right, so if I were to ask you just another question for a moment, if you were to just make a ballpark estimate, of how much of your time you think you spend engaged in this process, very broadly speaking, of back and forth communication, trying to reach agreement with your 3-year-old, with your spouse, with your coworkers, with your boss, with employees, with media, and so on, what would you say it was? You had to take a guess. What fraction of your time? 75%, 60? 57. How many would say it's at least half my time, just out of curiosity? Okay, so the great majority. So, we may not always think about it as negotiation, but in the broad sense of the term, we're getting to yes, or we're trying to get to yes, from the moment we get up in the morning to the moment we go to bed at night. It's the basic way that we get what we want in this world. And, we're decision makers, and if you think about your decisions, the overwhelming number of decisions we make is through negotiation. It's become the preeminent process. At work, in business, in politics, at home, in nonprofits, wherever you go. So let me ask you for a moment to pick any situation that you have in mind, just as we talk this evening. I think you'll get more value if you have at least in mind some situation. It could be at home, at work, some conflict, some situations giving you a little bit of trouble. And then let me ask you, if there are two types of negotiations. There's the internal ones inside the family, inside the organization, and then there are external ones outside, with customers or suppliers or media and so on. How many of you just in your mind, you just thought of an internal situation, inside? Okay. And how many of you have chosen an external one, outside? Okay. Both can be very difficult, but if you notice, the great majority of hands went up on inside. And if I were to ask you this last question here, which is, which negotiations do you find harder? Generally speaking, if you had to make a broad generalization, the external situations or the internal ones, what would you say? How many would say external, just curiosity, okay? How many would say internal? Take a look around the room. I mean, that's like over 90%. And isn't that interesting that oftentimes, even though we often think of negotiation as something, with people outside, you're going to buy a car or whatever it is, but it's the internal negotiations that often give us the greatest problem. So here's my question for you, which is, what, could be possibly more internal than the negotiation that goes on inside of ourselves? So perhaps it is not surprising, having specialized in difficult situations, that over the years I've come to the realization that actually the biggest obstacle to us getting what we want in life, the biggest obstacle to us being successful in negotiation is not what we usually think it is. We usually think it's that difficult person or that difficult organization or that difficult society. But in fact, the biggest obstacle I find is right here. It's ourselves. It's in our own human tendency to react, which is to act without thinking in ways that don't serve our interests. As the old saying from Ambrose Bierce goes, when angry, you will make the best speech you will ever regret. And that happens. Or as I remember, a New Yorker, actually, Teddy Roosevelt, once colorfully observed on this point, he said, if you could give a kick in the pants to the person responsible for most of your troubles, you wouldn't sit for a month. So perhaps our biggest opponent is the person we look at in the mirror every morning. And that also, our biggest obstacle, can become our biggest opportunity if we're able to turn that opponent, that inner opponent, into our biggest ally. So that's what I mean by getting to yes with yourself. How do you turn that opponent into that ally inside? Because in effect, what I've realized is we've been negotiating all along with one arm tied behind our back. We're focused on, influencing the other. We're focused outside on external techniques, and that's what generally I've taught. But in fact, the other arm is focusing on the inside, on influencing ourselves. So my question is, how can we use both arms? Because in today's challenging times, conflicts have gotten very difficult. So if we don't bring both arms, what chance do we have? How can we expect to get to yes with others if we haven't even gotten to yes with ourselves? This is, I've come to realize, is the missing first half of the process of getting to yes. It's the missing first half of, it's the prerequisite course I didn't even know existed when Roger Fisher and I wrote Getting to Yes over 30 years ago. So getting to yes, it turns out, is an inside job. So the question is, if that's the case, that the first and most important negotiation we ever engage in starts within, how do we do it? How do we get to yes with ourselves? So what I'd like to do is just briefly review a few of the key principles for getting to yes with yourself, for turning negotiation inward before we turn it outward. And then I'll go over a few principles, and I'd like to expand when it comes to questions and answers. But these principles are drawn from my own personal and professional experience over the past 3 decades, as well as study of the experience of others. And I encourage you to apply them to your situation, see if they work, and see what works for you, and make up your own method. But the basic foundation of this method, I find, is the ability to go to, I use the metaphor of, to go to the balcony. Because what often stops us, as I mentioned, is our natural reactions. We often get caught in what I call the 3A trap, which is we attack out of anger, we accommodate or give in out of fear, or we simply avoid, which doesn't solve the problem. The alternative is to go to the balcony. Imagine that you're on that you're up here negotiating on a stage. Part of your mind goes to a mental or emotional balcony, which is a place of perspective. It's a place of calm. It's a place of self-control. It's a place where fundamentally we can keep our eyes on the prize. What is truly important to us in this negotiation? And it's not always easy to do, particularly in this day and age, the age of the internet, because there's so much pressure on us to react, to act quickly. You get an email from a colleague, it makes you angry because you weren't consulted, and you just instantly compose that reply, and you have the satisfaction of hitting the reply button, but you just don't hit the reply button, you hit the reply all button, and it goes out to everyone, and then conflicts start to escalate. There's a little button on the screen which is rarely used, which is called Save as Draft. That's the balcony button. And that's the button we need to use more. You just, okay, get it out of your system, save it as a draft, then do whatever you like to do. Go for a workout, go for a walk around the block, just have tea with a friend, come back with some perspective. Look at that email, ask yourself, is that really going to serve my interests? And you're going to hit the delete button and pick up the phone and call the person or meet them even better. So that's the foundation, to me, of this method. But then the question is, how, people say it's not so easy to go to the balcony because we tend to fall off the balcony. We tend to get reactive. How do we stay on the balcony? And here's what do we do on the balcony? To me, the first step of going to the balcony is to understand our most worthy opponent, in other words, ourselves. People often ask me, what is the most important skill in negotiation? And over the years, the answer I usually give is, it's the ability to put yourself in the other side's shoes. Because after all, negotiation is an exercise in influence. You're trying to change someone's mind. How can you possibly change their mind if you don't know where their mind is? It's to listen to them. And I've been teaching that method, as it were, for many years, but as I have often observed, it's actually hard for people to do. It's hard for us to put ourselves in the other side's shoes. It's hard for us to listen. So what stops us from doing this? What stops us from doing this key step in getting to yes? It's us, of course, because we're so busy thinking about our problem. Our minds are so full of thoughts and feelings and self-doubts and self-criticisms that we have no mental space to focus on the other side. But if we're the problem, we are also possibly the solution. We can change that. We have the power to change that. And what I've come to realize is that there's an essential prior step to putting yourself in their shoes, which is the key, which is to put yourself in your own shoes. Now that may sound funny, because after all, are we not already in our own shoes? But the truth is I've found is how many of us can honestly say that we've truly, truly listened to ourselves in the way that maybe a good friend might. And if we can do this, I've found it can really help. Let me just, if you don't mind, give you an experience of my own, of a particularly challenging negotiation I had some years ago when I was beginning to develop this method with the then president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez. I was in Venezuela at the time serving as a third party between the government and the political opposition at a time of intense conflict, with many people fearing even a civil war. So my colleague, Francisco Diaz, and I had an appointment with the president, scheduled for 9 p.m. at night in the presidential palace, and we waited very patiently until about midnight. And finally, we were ushered in to see the president, and to my surprise, he wasn't alone. We saw his entire cabinet arrayed behind him. And so he asked me, he said, so Yuri, what's your impression of what's going on here in Venezuela? How are things going? And I said, Mr. President, I've been talking to some of your government ministers. I've been talking to the opposition, and it seems to me there's some progress. And he said, what do you mean progress? Are you crazy? You're naive, you're blind, you're not seeing all the tricks those dirty traitors on the other side are up to. And he proceeded to lean in very close to my face and yell at me for, I would say, approximately 30 minutes. Now, at that point, I'm getting very defensive in my mind. What do you mean I'm not crazy? You wanting to respond and whatever, and thinking, wow, 2 years of work down the drain here. But I was able in that moment to go to the balcony for a moment and just ask myself the question, what is my interest here? What am I really trying to do? Is it really going to help advance my cause, the cause of peace, to get into an argument with the president of Venezuela? So I just listened to him. And he was famous for giving 8-hour speeches, but after 30 minutes of me just listening calmly to him, finally, he began to run out of steam, and I saw his shoulders sink a little bit, and he said to me in a weary tone of voice, he said, "So Yuri, what should I do?" That is the sound of a human mind opening. And so I said to him, Mr. President, I think the entire country needs to go to the balcony. It's December, festivities last Christmas were all canceled. Why not have a truce? And he said, "Oh, that's a great idea. I'm going to propose that in my next speech." His mood had entirely shifted. How? Through me not reacting, through the power of not reacting, of going to the balcony. And how was I able to do that? Is that I'd taken a few moments of silence by myself before the meeting to listen to my own thoughts and feelings, kind of clear my mind, get to yes with myself, and therefore I was better able to get to yes with him when it came to him shouting at me in that situation. So my question is, what if before any sensitive meeting or phone call, we did the same? We just took a single moment to ourselves for a moment, just to listen to ourselves, just to clear our minds a little bit. Maybe if we did that, maybe it wouldn't be so hard, after all, to listen to others. So it's to see yourself, which you can see yourself from the balcony, as I did with President Chavez. I could watch, my own emotions and thoughts and not react, not act out of them. I could listen to myself, and what listening to yourself does is it helps you figure out what you really want. Now, that may seem obvious. You might think you know what you really want, but I've been amazed in so many situations how often we don't know what we truly, truly, truly want. Let me give you an example. About 1.5 years ago, I was invited by the wife and daughter of a very prominent Brazilian businessman, Abilio Diniz, to help him he was trapped in a terrible legal struggle with his former business partner over control of Brazil's largest retailer. It had been going on for 2.5 years. The Financial Times, it was all over the papers. The Financial Times called it perhaps the biggest cross-continental boardroom showdown in recent history. And it was extremely costly, stressful to families, to the 150,000 employees of the company. Anyway, so when I met with Abilio at his home and just listened to him, he told me the story, and I said, it didn't seem like he knew what he really wanted. Did he want to fight? He could be chairman for another 8 years. He was 76 at the time, so until he was 84. Is that how he wanted to spend the rest of his life? Or did he really want to look for an agreement here? Because he was feeling very badly treated. So I said to him, Abilio, tell me, what do you really want here? He said, okay, I'll tell you what I want. I want the stock at a certain price. I want the elimination of the non-compete clause. I want some real estate. He gave me a list. But I thought, there's got to be something behind that. I said, Abilio, you're a man who's got everything. What do you really want? And he thought about it for a moment, and he said, freedom. That's what I want. I want my freedom. And I said, what does freedom mean to you? He says, it's freedom to kind of do what I want, pursue the business deals I want, to spend time with my family, to have my life back. So that was it. I was hearing the human being behind those positions. Well, once we were clear about that being his deepest need, then the rest of the process was challenging but surprisingly quick. When I met with the representative of the other side, who was the leader of the Rothschild family, actually in France, who was representing the other side, I met him on a Monday in Paris at a restaurant and said, life is too short for these kinds of disputes. He said, how would you solve it? I said, well, let's just take 2 basic principles, freedom and dignity, and see if we can figure out a solution. He invited me back to his office the next day. That was Tuesday. By Friday, we had both men sitting there in Brazil, shaking hands, signing an agreement, joint press conference, wishing each other well, making a joint speech to the company executives. And the thing was over. And it wasn't just a grudging split the difference compromise. It was something that both men felt deeply satisfied with. How did that happen? It happened because Abilio was able to get to yes with himself. He was able to uncover his needs. With my help, he was able to listen to himself. So my question is, in your own situation, to ask yourself, what do you most want or need? what is truly important here for you? What is the real prize? What's the equivalent for you in your situation of freedom? Which then brings us to the next challenge that shows up in this process, which is, let's imagine you identify what you most want. Where does the power come from to meet that need? Because oftentimes in negotiation, we get lost in the blame game. In conflicts, it's always the other side's fault, and there's a lot of finger pointing going on. And when we do that, we don't realize it, but we're almost acting like we're victims of the other side. And by acting as victims, we're actually, without realizing it, surrendering our own power to affect the situation. In negotiation, the key to power in negotiation, there are many keys, but one of the most important ones is what we call your BATNA. It's an acronym standing for your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. It's essentially your best course of action if you can't reach agreement. If you can't reach agreement with one customer, you find another customer. If you can't reach agreement with one supplier, you find another supplier. If you can't reach agreement with, if you have a dispute, you could go to court, or find a mediator, much better. Those are the alternatives. But what I found is that it's not so easy for people to do that. Even though it's extremely important in negotiation to know your BATNA before you go into a negotiation, we tend to focus just on the agreement. We don't want to even think about the alternative. What stops us from developing our BATNA? Again, it's us, and we have the power to change that. So there's a key psychological antecedent, a prior missing step for developing your BATNA, which is to develop what I call your inner BATNA, which is basically a commitment you make to take care of yourself. Just think back to the story I just told you about my friend Abilio. I asked him that question. I said, so Abilio, who can give you the freedom that you most want? Who can give you that freedom? Is it really just the other side, your arch enemy, your arch opponent? Are you really just hostage of this man? Or to some extent at least, can you take responsibility and give yourself that freedom? And once he was clear on that, then he could say, okay, if I want my freedom, even if we don't have a deal yet, I can still move my office, set up a new office, pursue new deals. I can take my family on a new holiday. I can become chairman of a new company. I can get on with my life. And actually, paradoxically, having developed his inner BATNA and an outer BATNA, it was much easier, it made it easier psychologically to reach an agreement. Because it's harder to reach an agreement when we're psychologically totally dependent on the other side, if in fact we're hostage to them. So essentially, there's an inner work that accompanies the outer work of empowerment. So you might want to ask yourself again in your situation, some questions like, who is really responsible for meeting my deepest psychological needs? Is it the other side? Is it my spouse? Is it my coworkers? Who is it? Or is it myself? You could ask yourself, what could I do to meet my needs independently? How can I take care of myself? That's your inner BATNA. So that brings us to the next challenge, which is to change the game of negotiation from a win-lose contest, which often leads to a lose-lose outcome. If we can change the game from an adversarial confrontation to a cooperative exercise in joint problem solving. How do we do that? I mean, that's what I work on with companies, with organizations, with individuals, with societies, and that's not so easy for people because what I find, the biggest block again is our own mindset. Let me just, if I may, maybe perhaps a few of you would like to participate in a quick 30-second negotiation exercise, maybe even shorter. If you wouldn't mind, some of you, just turning to the person next to you and getting into arm wrestling position with them. Arm wrestling, as if you were going to arm wrestle. You can hold up your arm with one hand. Okay, for those of you who are game for this. Okay, so let's imagine that this is a game and your objective is to win the game and you want to maximize your number of points, right? So let's imagine you get 1,000 points every time you get the other person's arm downed. Okay? Get ready, get set, go. Now, what I see here is there is a learning experience going on here. I see a lot of people started like this, 0-0, right? If you're stronger, maybe you get the other person's arm down once. But then I see like a light bulb go on for a number of you saying, wait a minute, I'm trying to maximize number of points. Well, if I relax my arm, give you 1,000 points, you relax your arm, you give me 1,000, and pretty soon we're accumulating tens of thousands of points. What happened there is we changed our mindset. In other words, we so often approach negotiations as if it's an arm wrestle. Who's going to win this one, right? You change the mindset. So maybe the greatest power we have in negotiation is that ability to change the game by changing that internal mindset. Now, how do we do that? What's the key to that? I think actually, interestingly, one of the answers came from Albert Einstein here, who in the wake of World War II, in the wake of the atom bomb, he basically asked the question. He said, look, the most important question facing any one of us is the universe a friendly place? This is the first and most basic question all people must answer for themselves. Now, why did Albert Einstein ask that question? Why? Because he reasoned that if we see the universe as basically hostile, we will naturally treat other people as enemies. And on a collective level, we're likely to arm ourselves to the teeth and react at the first provocation. And given the weapons of mass destruction at our disposal, we'll eventually destroy ourselves as well as all life on Earth. But if we can see, Einstein reasoned, the universe as basically friendly, even when it seems to be adverse, then we're more likely to treat others as at least potential partners. We're more likely to get to yes, even in difficult situations. And what he realizes, that's a choice. That's a choice that we can make. We can choose, because who knows whether the universe is a friendly place or not, but we can choose, and this is one of the great powers in negotiation, is the power to reframe your inner picture. From scarcity, this kind of view that there isn't enough, and therefore I've got to grab all I can, to a picture of sufficiency, that there is enough to go around. And if we can do that, if we can see life basically on our side, if we can choose to do that, then we're more likely to be able to engage in a kind of win-win interaction with others. So again, there's an inner psychological antecedent to a key point in negotiation. So question to ask yourself in your situation, for example, is where does your satisfaction ultimately come from? Does it just come from outside? Is it other people who always have to satisfy you? Or to some measure, are you capable of manufacturing your own happiness, your own contentment, meeting your own psychological needs? To what extent is that possible? Is there enough? And to actually engage that scarcity mindset that's in all of us, really, and see if you can move it to sufficiency. Can I see life on my side? Because if we can make that choice, and it's ultimately our decision, it can make a huge difference in our lives. So essentially, I've just kind of reviewed a few of the steps in this process of getting to yes with yourself. Putting yourself in your shoes, developing your inner BATNA, reframing your picture, which then sets you up for other steps, like the ability to, what athletes call, is to stay in the zone, to stay on the balcony. And the zone is a place of flow. It's a place of peak performance, peak satisfaction, where we're focused in the present moment. How do we do that and bring that to our negotiations, which both bring some satisfaction inside and more effectiveness outside? And then ultimately then, it allows us to break a cycle, which is what holds us in conflict, which is the other side rejects us, we reject them, they reject us back, we reject them back, they disrespect us, we disrespect them. Someone needs to break that cycle. If we can draw on our own self-respect as people like Martin Luther King, for example, was able to do, then you're able to respect the other side, even if at first they don't respect you. And you're more likely to change that cycle. And also to do the same thing with cooperation. If we're the first to cooperate, to give to the other side, then we're more likely to receive. You know, with Abilio, one key measure was, the way we turned that around was, the whole dynamic had been, how do I take from the other side? And we changed it to, how do we give to the other side? Can we give you your freedom? Can we give you dignity? Focused on what you can give and get the cycle going in a more positive way, which then helps us transform even very difficult situations into possible solutions, possible ways in which both sides can benefit. Now, this whole process takes regular practice, but the good thing is that we have a chance to practice these principles every day, because after all, who are we negotiating with? Ourselves. We spend a lot of time with ourselves every day, and so we can practice. And what it does is it allows us to turn an inner yes, to begin with an inner yes, which then allows us to turn it into an outer yes with others. And that, in turn, gives us three kinds of victories, three wins. Essentially, it gives us a win inside of us, which is a degree of inner satisfaction. As Abilio put it, I got my life back. There's a win inside. And then there's also a win outside with the other side. And finally, what's even more important is this method kind of brings with it a more generous perspective that allows us to benefit not just ourselves and the other side, but our families, the larger community, the workplace. In Abilio's situation, 150,000 employees of the company. That's the real goal. It's not just win-win, but win-win-win. It's not just a win for Republicans and Democrats, win-win. The real win is for the country, is for all of us, the citizens of this country. That's the real audacious goal that I think we need to go for these days, because with a win-win approach, there's almost no problem in our workplaces, in our home lives, in the world that we can't solve. Let me just end, if I may, with a story from the waning months of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was in the White House, and he was starting to give speeches and speak sympathetically about the South, and saying we need to bind the wounds of this nation afterwards. And there was a Yankee patriot in the audience in one of his speeches, and she took him to task, and she said, "Mr. President, how dare you speak kindly of our enemies when you ought to be thinking of exterminating them, destroying them?" And Lincoln paused for a moment, he thought about it, and he said, "Madam, do I not destroy my enemies when I turn them into my friends?" And that is the key here. That's the key mind shift, because very little in our lives may ever be under our full control. But we always have the choice to make between yes and no at any point. We can choose to say no to ourselves and be our own worst opponent, or we can choose to say yes to ourselves and become our own best ally. We can choose to see life as our foe, saying no to life, or we can choose to see life as our friend, saying yes to life. We can choose to see others as implacable adversaries, or we can choose to see others as potential partners, just as Lincoln did when he sought to destroy his adversaries by turning them into our friends. And these choices, in my experience, make all the difference. Make all the difference in helping us win the most important game of life, the most important game of all, which is the game of life. Thank you very much. So, I'm ready for questions.
Just one. We're doing another sweep.
You're doing another sweep, yeah. Great. Okay, here's one question. Okay, first question is, how would you approach a negotiation to resolve the dispute between the free speech rights of Charlie Hebdo and the anger felt by the Muslim community. It's an easy one to start with, right? So, to me, when we think of negotiation, we think of talking, right? And yet, what I've always observed when I observe the practice of successful negotiators, I find that they listen far more than they talk. So to me, kind of the first step in any negotiation, particularly one that's loaded with such deep emotion, and where there's validity on both sides of an issue like this, because life is complex. It's not that there's a right side and a wrong side on this issue, is it has to begin with listening, deep listening to the other side. And speaking that this took place in Paris, I'm reminded of a methodology that was evolved at the University of Paris in the Middle Ages, where they were having kind of debates, even like philosophical or theological debates that often got extremely heated, believe it or not, as academic debates and theological debates can become. And so someone came up with a rule, said, look, you can only speak and try and respond to your opponent's words if you can summarize to your opponent's satisfaction what they just said. So you can imagine that slowed down the conversation a lot. But essentially, in order to speak, you had to basically repeat, paraphrase what the other person had just said. And I find, that might be a very useful methodology to use in this particular thing, which is because oftentimes we think we're listening. We may be hearing the words, but we're not truly listening. Because true listening means listening not just from your point of view, where you're beginning to criticize and say, well, that's not right, and that's not true listening. True listening is where you put yourself in the other side's shoes and you understand from their perspective, how they see, how they feel it. So I would begin with listening. Okay. Second question. These are good questions. How useful is psychiatry, therapy, in internal negotiations? Well, I would say it could be exceedingly useful. I mean, I just gave an example of my friend Abilio. He would certainly say that. He regularly, throughout this whole process and for years before, goes on a weekly basis to his therapist. And so that helped him a lot because he was very reactive. And the ability to talk out with someone, to help someone else as a third person can help you listen to yourself, can help you put yourself in your own shoes, can help you think about your inner Batna, can help you reframe. So I would think it could be extremely helpful, just as mediators are very helpful in external negotiation. Therapists and psychiatrists are kind of internal mediators. Okay. Third question. They're all good. How can lawmakers in Congress work better together? Well, I've had some experience over the years of trying to bring Democrats and Republicans together. Many years ago, I had the privilege of participating in a congressional retreat in Hershey, Pennsylvania with, I believe, like 200 members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, and their families, which was a good step. And we broke up into very small groups of maybe, let's say, we'd have 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans and their spouses in the circle. And one of the questions we'd ask is, so we asked, in particular, we're interested in hearing the spouses, what's the personal toll of this conflict on you and your lives? And it was interesting, they opened up a lot. And I was really struck by if you can bring these people together. And the trouble is right now in Congress is it used to be that Democrats and Republicans used to live in D.C. But now most of them don't even live in D.C. anymore. They have maybe an apartment in D.C., but they live back home in their constituency and they're always flying back. So they're not like neighbors, Democrat or Republican, their kids go to the same school or the same little league or whatever. So a lot of those relationships are torn. And I remember during this retreat, one congressperson said, I've just spent more time talking to a member of the opposite party on this train ride from Washington to D.C., of Washington to Hershey, than I have in the previous 5 years in Congress. So, you know, if you don't talk, if you don't listen, if you don't have relationships, you're going to be very hard. So I'd say that would be the first thing. How can lawmakers in Congress learn to work better together? I would say is spend some time together and be encouraged. I just heard a story last night, actually, of an event where Democrats and Republicans were together with their spouses, and they all sat separately, but two spouses, one Democrat and one Republican, sat together. And I don't remember which of the parties, but they were both of those spouses were roundly condemned by their respective sides for sitting next to each other. They were mothers, or I don't even know if, I think they were women, but they might not have been, but you know, who had common relationship. And so that's how bad it's gotten. So I think it begins with just basic human decency of building those relationships, and then applying these same things. I think, you know, one of the biggest problems is it starts here. Is every side is so reactive. At the first provocation, it's just like blow after blow reaction. We need to learn to collectively go to the balcony. Next question. Do you believe from your experience we can uncover our greatest needs from listening to our hearts or our minds? Explain how you know this to be true. How can we tell if we're questioning if our internal gut feeling is from our mind versus our heart? Wow. Very interesting question. So I think there's room, and there's a lot of room in negotiation for both the mind and the heart. It's not one versus the other. We actually need both. And for example, this question about, you know, how can you tell? You can tell when you actually bring them together. You can use the mind, for example, to go to the balcony and to kind of observe what's going on. But the act of listening is with our heart. You know, we actually listen. If we listen well, we're not just listening with our mind to the words, we're listening to the feelings that are underlying those words. So we need both, heart and mind. And I mean, just take an example where, you know, sometimes people think, okay, going to the balcony means, you know, okay, just take all the emotion out of the negotiation. I don't think that that's even useful, because emotions play a very valuable role in negotiation. Emotions, for one thing. I mean, how can you tell if someone's lying to you? It's not really your mind. Your mind can be fooled by it. But what you do is you get this gut feeling in your stomach. It's almost like in your intestine. I mean, they say there are more neurons, or as many neurons in your intestine as in your brain. But anyway, you get this gut feeling that something is incongruent, something's off. And then you can explore it with your mind and say, could that be true, that they're not telling the truth, and so on. We need, our emotions also are kind of like, they lead us, they're clues, they're signals that lead us in the form of dissatisfaction. They point us in the way of unsatisfied needs of ours that need to be met. So I'm a big believer in integrating both heart and mind in our negotiation process and being integral in that sense. Okay. What's a good way to know that you've achieved the view from the balcony, a change of perspective that you need? Again, I would say, you know, the kind of the criteria I put up there is, you know, you've achieved the view from the balcony if you feel like you've got, if you feel calm, for one thing, if you feel calm, if you feel in control of yourself, you're not just reactive, you're not just immediately impulsively acting. If you have a kind of a view almost of the bigger picture, that you kind of can see, for example, yourself, you can listen well to the other side, but you can also see, for example, one of the key things in negotiation is the ability to not just see the person on the other side of the table, but to ask yourself, who is not at the table? Because oftentimes in negotiations get blocked not by the people at the table, but by the people who are not at the table. Who should you have included in this conversation? Who is a potential spoiler? Who is a potential stakeholder who's been left out, who's going to feel upset and might, interrupt the implementation of that agreement? I can think of lots of situations where people worked very hard. I've been in them myself. I'll just give you just one, for example. One of my very earliest negotiations, because I really believe not just in teaching or staying in academia, but actually practicing this to the full. So early on, when I was a graduate student, I got a job. I was looking for any job in negotiation. I got a job as a mediator in a coal mine in Kentucky, where the miners were going out on strike all the time, wildcat strikes in contravention of the contract, and there were. The judge finally, after so many times, actually jailed the workforce in his infinite wisdom for a night, which didn't help much. And then there were guns coming out, and there was violence, and there were bomb threats. Anyway, my colleague Steve Goldberg and I went down and we started listening to each side. Believe it or not, union management would not even sit in the same room together. That's how high the emotions were. And so we did this kind of shuttle diplomacy for about 6 weeks. And finally, we're able to bring enough to the parties that they were willing to sit down and work it out. And there were, 10 or 12 people from the union and an equal number from management. And we got them together for a few days, like at a retreat, and they finally reached an agreement. And they were, it was like a peace treaty. They were so excited. And then there was one little detail, which is the agreement had to be ratified by the miners. And everyone assumed it was a formality. And sure enough, a week later, the vote came in nearly unanimous in rejecting the very agreement that had just been painfully negotiated. And why did they reject it? Not because it wasn't a good agreement, because on paper it was better than what they had, but there was so little trust, so much distrust, that they thought anything that management has signed its name to, there must be a trick, safer to reject it. So when you're on the balcony, when you're having that big picture, you need to be thinking. I always think, wait a minute, it's not just at that table. What's going on at the internal table, the internal constituents that I don't know about? And you can do that with that balcony perspective. Okay, next question. Is there any time when you should walk away from a, right, is there any time when you should walk away from a negotiation? Well, the answer is yes. This is why, particularly in difficult situations, but really in any situation, it's always good to think through, even briefly, what's my BATNA? What's my best alternative to a negotiated agreement? Because it may well be that you may have to resort to it. You may have, what's your best course of action for satisfying your interests if you cannot reach agreement? And interestingly enough, when I think about what's the purpose of negotiation, oftentimes people would think, okay, the purpose of negotiation is to reach agreement. I beg to differ a little bit. I think the purpose of negotiation is to satisfy your interests. It's to explore whether you can find a way to satisfy your interests and the other side better than you could then by resorting to your BATNA, your best alternative. So your best alternative isn't just worst case thinking, it's alternative positive thinking. It's an alternative thing. And to me, it would be a perfectly successful negotiation, for example, if a buyer and a seller come into a room and they each quickly discover that they actually can each do better with their alternatives than they can by making a deal. They shake hands and say, we'll do business next time. That's a successful negotiation because the purpose is to satisfy your interests better than your BATNA. So yes, there are circumstances under which you should walk away if, in fact, your alternative is better, meets your interests better than this particular agreement. So it's not just seeking agreement for agreement's sake. It's seeking agreement that actually works for you and meets your interests and meets your needs and ideally meets the interests of the other side as well. Okay, next question. How could Abraham have negotiated more effectively with Sodom? Maybe over Sodom and Gomorrah, I guess that must be. Okay, so as you recall from your Bible, the first scriptural negotiation that we know about was the negotiation with Abraham, who was maybe the first negotiator, who decided to negotiate with the most powerful being in his universe, in the universe, which is the Almighty. And God basically, as you recall, confided in Abraham his intention to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because of the wicked ways of its inhabitants. And Abraham actually, instead of just keeping quiet, decided to challenge. I mean, it's the first instance of a human being challenging a divine, the divine creator, and talk about an asymmetrical power situation. And so Abraham says, oh, look, what if I can find, I can't remember what the number was, but I think it was 50, righteous people. Would you still destroy these cities? And God had to think twice about it and say, if I think about divine justice, well, maybe not. And then Abraham gathered up his courage and said, well, what if I can only find 45? And God again said, well, no. And then Abraham said, what about 40? Anyway, it goes on until finally they established the number as 10. And tragically enough, Abraham was not able to find 10 righteous people when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. But first of all, I want to take my hat off to Abraham in that story. I mean, to actually, think about the disparity of power and the courage it took to challenge the higher power using the very principles of divine justice. It's really, that's why I think of Abraham really as, in some sense, as the first negotiator and really, the first defender of human rights, really standing up for the life and value of human beings. And perhaps some of you know, but it's been my privilege over the years to have helped develop a path in the Middle East that follows the story of Abraham, the journey of Abraham. It's called the Abraham Path. And if you're interested, there's even a website called abrahampath.org, but it's even more than a website. There's a physical path where we have our team, our partners, have developed over 1,000 kilometers of path in different Middle Eastern communities to actually help people remember the stories of Abraham and what it represents, because what he represents in that region for people is he represents for everyone this tradition of hospitality, which is what you find so deeply rooted in the area of kindness towards strangers. So, but he was also the first negotiator in some sense, the first champion of human rights in some sense, and negotiation and human rights, I think, would be welcome or very much needed in that region. So I would encourage you, if any of you would like to come walk in the Middle East, I'm actually going there with my colleague Anissa Mehdi, who's here in the audience here, who's the co-chair of the Abraham Path. We're going to walk the path in a month or two, and it's, believe it or not, people are walking, and it's a long-term project. It's a project for the ages. Paths can last hundreds of years, thousands of years even. This memory of Abraham is embedded, that cultural memory of Abraham is embedded in the region for a long time, for 4,000 years. And so one thing I know is that no matter what conflicts happen, that path will outlast those conflicts and will hopefully contribute to understanding that may help resolve those conflicts in a more effective way. Next question, and I think we have time for just a few more. What is a good way to know that you, oh no, I've got that one. How useful is faith in internal and external negotiations? How useful is faith? Well, speaking of Abraham, Abraham must have had a lot of faith, to have taken on that particularly difficult negotiation. I would say, what's faith? there are people of faith, and I mean, like an example of the last point I made, which is faith can help you reframe the situation, can help you answer Einstein, who was not, as I understood, it wasn't a believer didn't consider himself to be a believer, at least in the traditional sense of God. But faith, whether you do it through religion, faith in God, or faith in the universe, that can definitely help you, obviously, in seeing the world as more friendly, and therefore makes it easier, or could make it easier, not always, but could make it easier to reframe the situation in a more constructive way. So I'd say it's potentially quite helpful. Can you give us an example of one of the worst negotiations and one of the best, and what made them so? Well, let's see. Here, let me just think here. Maybe I'll frame that as one of my most difficult negotiations. Maybe you can call it my worst negotiation. I was involved many years ago as a third party between the government of Russia and the government of Chechnya, and we brought them together for their first international meeting, leaders on both sides, to see if we could bring an end to the war in Chechnya. And although we were successful in helping to negotiate a ceasefire, the trouble was that in order to preserve and maintain that ceasefire, you needed to do something with the underlying causes of the war, which also had to do with the fact that you had all these young men, in this particular case, who had no jobs, the economy was depressed. And to me, one of the great missed opportunities of the world was that the world didn't recognize that and say, okay, let's try and restore, rebuild Chechnya, give them jobs and create economic opportunity, because the ceasefire was precarious. It broke down, went back into war. And just, the consequences we don't even understand. It seemed like a very far away place at the time. Why should we care about Chechnya? But it was curious to me, it was tragic actually, that when the terrible terrorist attack came here in New York City, that the leader of the terrorist band, Mohammed Atta, when I looked into his biography, why did he join Al-Qaeda? He joined Al-Qaeda because of Chechnya, and he signed up to fight in Chechnya. And then in another city where I've spent a lot of time, which is Boston, who were the terrorists the young men who blew up that bomb at the Boston Marathon? Again, 2 young men from Chechnya. So if we don't pay attention to these situations, if we don't prevent these situations, if we don't actually deal with them, the consequences come back to everyone. And so that's one of the worst ones. One of the best ones, to me, I won't take mind, but one that comes to mind right now, was a negotiation that literally made it possible for us to be alive today here, which was the negotiation between John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev at the peak of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it actually was between Robert Kennedy and Anatoly Dobrynin, who was a Soviet ambassador, who, when the world was teetering on the brink, we almost went to nuclear war, were able to negotiate a good, face-saving way out for both sides. And that, to me, is one of the best negotiations I can think of in my lifetime. More questions. Let me see here. See if I can get through these. Has the art of negotiation changed in the world of cable TV debates where everyone seems to have inflexible positions? Well, I think it's true. With cable TV basically segmenting the audiences so that everyone basically hears the points of view that they want to hear and it just gets confirmed in this kind of endless loop, it tends to reinforce people's positions, and it makes it harder to reach across the aisle and get to yes. So it's certainly made it more challenging. But do I think it's impossible? No, I do think it's possible. And I know examples, for example, in Washington where people still manage to work across the aisle, and more of that's needed. And actually, what can help is if we, as the American people, start to demand it more, and reinforce, support the action of reaching across the aisle, working together in Congress to get to yes. Another question. Let me just check the time here for a moment. Yeah, we've got a couple more minutes. How to get your boss to appreciate, i.e. pay you more? These questions are really, it's amazing, this field of negotiation. This is one of the things I love about it, is that it's so rich and diverse. You get questions from micro to macro. Okay, how do you get your boss to appreciate and pay you more? Pay you more money. Well, I think, again, if the thing is, what I've noticed about these situations is, it could be a tense situation when you're asking your boss for a raise, and a lot of us feel very uncomfortable. I think the key thing, first of all, is to prepare. Just like you rehearse an important speech, you ought to rehearse your interaction with your boss. But just as importantly, it seems to me, is when we approach a situation, we tend to think about our problem. We tend to think about how much we deserve, and so on. I find that that's important. You want to get to yes with yourself. And in fact, you want to use these very same techniques, because we can be very reactive. We can, that can generate a lot of fear. And when we feel fear, we might just give in, and give in too easily, and not really stand up for what we deserve and what we need. But I would say, having gone to the balcony, having put yourself in your own shoes, having developed your own inner BATNA, really strengthened your self-confidence that, yeah, no matter what, whether you get the raise or not, you can take care of your needs. Having reframed, then I think from that position, you can begin to put yourself in your boss's shoes and trying to understand how they see the situation, and see if you can help solve the boss's problem. Maybe the boss has a problem with their boss. Maybe there's some budgetary problem. Maybe you can then start to be creative and say, wait a minute, if I can help solve the boss's problem, for example, if there's a tight budget, maybe I can find another source of income from new clients or something, and you can convince the boss to pay you part of that as a commission or whatever. You can just be creative. And then the other thing to ask yourself is, why do you want the money? Because maybe you may not get all the money, but maybe it's the money, for example, to send your kids to college. Well, if you then say, if you're clear about what your underlying interests are, then maybe, who knows, there's a tuition loan program. Or maybe it's because you feel that it sounds like to appreciate you more, which is recognition. In addition to getting the raise, maybe you could get a job that gives you more exposure, more recognition, more face time with the top, travel, a new title, whatever it is. Just think about all the creative ways in which you could meet your need for recognition that could satisfy you, in addition to just an increase in the paycheck. All comes from, again, putting yourself in your shoes, asking yourself, what is it that you really want? Okay, again, we're going from the micro to the macro. Working at the UN on climate change, most know what has to be done, but 194 countries around the table, and every one of them afraid to give up too much. Is the problem too many actors? So, well, that is it. I wouldn't say it's an overwhelming problem, but it's a huge obstacle. But I used to have a colleague who was an economist who was his name was Kenneth Boulding, and he used to like to say, what exists is possible. So when you say 194 countries around the table, well, I think, okay, are there precedents for this? And I think, for example, of the law of the sea negotiations, which involved then there were maybe 150, 160 countries, but basically the number is in the same ballpark, negotiating about what happens to 2/3 of the world's surface, the oceans. And they were able to reach an agreement. How? Through very ingenious negotiation, using a methodology that's called the single negotiating text process, which is realizing that 194 positions, it's going to be very hard to get to an agreement. But if you can use a single text, in other words, someone in this particular case, the UN facilitator who was actually from Singapore at that moment, his name was Tommy Koh, he put together a single text of somewhere to try to accommodate all these differing interests, and then went around to the 160 countries and say, where does this not meet your interests? Where is this unfair? And it gradually evolved through kind of continuous evolution. It was a text that no one was asked to accept, but was just kind of like a little bit like, like a pearl in an oyster. Everyone kind of irritates and gets it around it. And over months of many, 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 many drafts, it became the Law of the Sea Treaty. And I would think that, with the climate change, we're going to need ingenious negotiation methods like that one. And that's the thing about negotiation, is we're just in the infancy of inventing new ways. And we need the same ingenuity that we apply in Silicon Valley to new kinds of computer software and applications and so on. We need to apply it to negotiation, to the process of getting to yes. And that could help us with climate change. Okay, I think I'll just take, it looks like the 3 questions, and I think that'll be our time. Okay. Only 2 questions left. Oh, we got that one. I think we got them all. Let me see. Yes, I think that was quite, you'll forgive me, but that was quite a tour of, the human condition, from getting the raise to climate change to psychiatry to hearts and minds to Paris and what's going on. So I just want to end by saying, my training originally is in anthropology. And as an anthropologist, as I look at this particular time, we're living in an age what one might call the negotiation revolution, because the manner of decision-making has shifted. It used to be a generation or 2 ago, the major way people made decisions around the planet is very much the people on the top give all the orders and the people on the bottom follow them. And nowadays, to get our jobs done, literally, we have to negotiate all the time, because thanks to the internet, thanks to the knowledge revolution, decision-making is increasingly becoming more horizontal and less vertical, which is a good thing. But it also means that there's a lot more conflict, because a lot of suppressed conflict comes out because everyone wants to have a voice. So we're in this amazing time of innovation and evolution, and I encourage all of you because you're all pioneers, we're all pioneers in this negotiation revolution. And on the fate of our children rests on our ability to get to yes. And the first radical step in that process is for us to learn to get to yes with ourselves. Thank you very much.